This is actually a presentation that's really about good news, and after many years of trying to climb up the stack of deploying v6, yeah, very much a presentation about how things have worked out for us over the last many years. And, you know, to summarise the ending, they've worked out pretty well. Things are actually working remarkably nicely. So in a world full of complications and challenges, it's nice to know that things can actually work out the right way. Last week, by sheer coincidence, we won an award for our v6 work at, I think, called an ANZIA award. So I now have yet another piece of large, dangerous-looking plastic to threaten people with at airline check-in counters. So that's a great thing to start with. It was a great thing to start last week with. So I'm going to talk today about our deployment delivery. As I said, it's a good news story. So let's talk about the good news and try and give you a few insights along the way. You only get the one slide, fortunately, about why we're here, because everyone does it. We are here about IP address space exhaustion, but it is worth underscoring that in the last 10 years, generally, and perhaps and even for longer than that, a lot of energy was spent trying to find other reasons why people should deploy IPv6. At the end of the day, every other reason has been co-opted back into the v4 stack. So it is just all about the numbers. But the point about that, and it's something I think we can lose if we are one form or another of geek, is that in the real world, those numbers, while they're dramatically important to people, are totally invisible to them. Our actual customer base don't care about those numbers at all. Their interaction with the world is entirely with named services, or perhaps with, you know, these days with things they punch on the screen of their smartphone. These numbers are totally invisible to them, up to but not, you know, up to the point where things stop working. They really don't care about that. It's interesting as an aside that that's also starting to happen in the realm of telephone numbers as well. You know, how many of you you have to think about the proportion of time you dial someone on a smartphone by mashing their name on the screen? There's an awful lot of context I have no idea what their telephone number is. And that's become the norm for us. So in fact, the internet way of doing it, of having a name as the primary and a number as a subsidiary that you don't see, has spread to other places, even those very esoteric places like the good old-fashioned POT service, at least for as long as that survives in our modern world. So the point, again, is that the presence of IPv6 in our networks, whether we're a service provider, an enterprise, or a user, is something that, done properly, is an exercise in complete invisibility. This is a challenge, and as we've heard in the summits to date, of course, it's a challenge in terms of management justification of effort as well. Again, until, as Tony suggested this morning, until there's a disaster, until you've got to catch the ball at the last minute. It's very hard to justify this when the outcome of doing it perfectly, absolutely perfectly, is that none of your customer base notice a thing. You know, it's very hard to make that an exciting proposition at a management boardroom table. You know, we do this properly, it works. If we do it really badly, everyone notices the world ends and we broke it. Aren't we heroes? That's really been quite a challenge for a long time in this realm. And the enormity of the fact that the numbers really are running out now is the primary motivator, of course, for action to be beginning at last for a whole lot of people that are kind of otherwise lagging that curve. To talk about where we've got to, I'm going to start briefly by talking about where we've been. A long, long time ago in a galaxy far, far away, there was a geek, the geek on the right, who decided that there was some merit in being an early adopter in this space. And that geek, who might look like me but with some more hair, really felt like it was a great thing to be getting on with and a great thing to understand. And I recall writing a magazine article at least 10 years ago that was on the front page of a now defunct paper-based communications magazine about how IPv6 was important and really cool and would be deployed fully within 18 months. And so, as always with these things, it's not about what you're going to do, it's about the time frame you're going to do it in. For interest, the guy on the left is Cliff Stoll. If any of you ever are old enough to have read the Cuckoo Beg, that's him. Slightly mad, quite entertaining gentleman. So we decided to get on with this thing, and what I did at Internode was to challenge my technical staff to go out and have a play with the thing. And this was so early that there was absolutely no obvious customer demand. So we just hooked into the IPv6 internet. We found some upstreams that provided native IPv6, international ones, hooked into that internet. We had the sense already, and I hold the sense, that tunneling isn't just transitional, it's actually a complication I personally prefer to live without. So we've always driven towards having a purely native network. We did start out running tunnel servers. We've got a Hexago tunnel server sitting somewhere in the server room, but I couldn't tell you where it is anymore, because it's not about that, it's about truly native IPv6. So the point here, and we've heard it already this morning, is it's about getting going, you know, in a perfect world, getting going early. At this point, getting going late but rapidly. One way or another, go out and play. That message is a very good one. We've heard it already, and I'd emphasise that. There's nothing better than familiarity here. to make things relatively smooth when you need them to be. So that was a long time ago. I can't quite remember when we did that first. It was around about 04 or 05 probably that we started actually hooking our network in. By 2008, we got to the point of actually running native dual stack, right? Dual stack, sorry about the joke, across our network. So we had our core routers running IPv6 and IPv4 at the same time. And we started offering native direct IPv6 access to people on fixed hand-configured services. So Ethernet ports in our co-location racks, Ethernet jacks that are coming out of fibre links. Any sort of fixed data centre connection or fixed high-end custom connection, we could start offering a v6 native connection to. For amusement, so that was 08. For amusement, that's about the point Telstra got to just now. Yay. So the early adopter thing's worth something, at least if you like that kind of thing. And it's actually a bit unfair to single them out. It's everybody else, which is still something that causes me some amazement in 2012. So the next year, in 2009, we decided the obvious thing to do was to get customers of ours, every single customer of ours, who wanted access to this marvellous new way of having more numbers in their world, to have access to it. So in late 2009, we launched Australia's first national trial, an opt-in trial of access to IPv6 natively. So it meant that any of our broadband customer base around the country, regardless of access technology, ADSL, even dial-up if you felt like it, had complete access to v6 by going to a toolbox and deciding to turn it on. And the point is you had to decide to turn it on, otherwise nothing happened. In 2009, there was still an awful lot of bugs and an awful lot of routers, so opt-in was the only rational thing to do to avoid breaking people's routers out from under them. But we turned it on, and this is roughly what the world thought. Right? I've got no idea what you're talking about, so here's a picture of a rabbit with a pancake on its head. In other words, the general population, and as I've, to emphasise what I started out saying, said IPv what? As long as they could get their interwebs, they were perfectly happy. So it didn't change the world externally, but it was an absolute key for us to starting to change it internally, to starting to move forward with what we had to do as an engineering-based internet service provider. So the however here is that while the general population didn't particularly care, there were a small group of rugged individuals in our customer base who decided this was terribly cool and they must have, they had to rush to turn it on. So we did have some of our customers took up that challenge, enabled IPv6 so they could tell their friends that they knew what there's no place like : 1 means, right, which is the v6 version of the old v4 t-shirt. And they started their own learning process in their homes or in their offices. And we discovered to our pleasure that the people that did that weren't just home users, they were router vendors. They were vendors of home CPE that finally had a real-world test case that wasn't their own internal lab that would do v6. So it was actually very useful, I feel, to the industry in Australia as well, that there was a way to go out and play with someone else's real deployment network. Very much framed as a trial, because it was all very shiny and new, but it worked, and actually it worked extremely smoothly. By late 2010, that trial had been going for a while. We ran it for well over a year in that kind of trial mode. We're not quite at the Google level of leaving things in beta for half the life of one of my kids, but it's a long time to leave it in beta. And by the end of that beta process, we had hundreds of customers using it. The astonishing number, hundreds. And I must admit at this point a mistake was pointed out to me mercifully after I gave the presentation where I first put that slide up in 2010 at the 2010 IPv6 Summit, where I said we got the 1% of our customer base. I have a maths degree. It's 0.1% of our customer base that we got to at that point, right? So it really wasn't a whole lot of people. But the deep point is it was actually enough. No one doing that was doing it for kicks. They were doing it because they were interested in it. This is actually important because that interested population was enough of a population to get the wheels turning. As I said, it included router vendors, at least one router vendor, home gateway router vendor, who we had not been reselling the products of to that point, called us about 3 months later and said, so we signed up to your internet service and turned on the v6 stuff and we've got our stack working in our router. Will you sell it now? And, to which the answer was yes. That was exactly what we were trying to do. We were trying to build a rolling stone that said, we're not going to buy any more routers from people unless they really do v6. We have a real network, so make it work. That was a really smart idea. Netcom, by the way, to their credit, it was a smart thing to decide to do. Meanwhile, back in the real world, other things were going on at the same time as this. And we've heard this earlier in the summit this week, but it's worth reiterating that those other things are tremendously important. Some enabling was happening in other places that are critical. In particular, enabling of IPv6 was quietly happening in PCs, in the Mac OS universe and in the Wintel universe. So that at this point, if you've bought a laptop any time in the last few years and you're running something like a modern operating system on it, v6 is absolutely in there, it's running, and critically it is turned on by default. What that means is those of you with laptops here, if you have that laptop on the Wi-Fi network that we're running here at the Summit, which is v6 enabled, you have a v6 address, you're reaching out and using v6 right now, and if we as an industry have got it right, you wouldn't know that unless you went looking. It's tremendously important how clean that process has become and the fact that it does work that cleanly. Perhaps even more importantly for all of us, the same thing has clearly happened in smartphones. The dominant smartphone vendors as well got v6 in there and it's running. And I'll relate something interesting because it turns out that multiple people have said to me in the course of this summit, hey, it's really nice to put the internet access in here for the summit, but it's not running IPv6. What's with that? Because they've gone to the panel of their iPhone and said, well, I've got a v4 address, there's no v6 address, I'm not running IPv6. I'm using the network, it's great, right? But it's obviously not running v6. And the answer to that is Apple don't actually display the v6 address in that panel, but it's still switched on. If you don't believe me, there's two easy ways to find out. One is download a really cool app I just got pointed out to me, IPv6 Toolkit, and bring up all the interface stats. But the more direct one is, if you've got an iPhone here and you don't believe me, just go and surf to AppNic, so www.appnic.net. At the top of that page, it will show you the IP address you're coming in via, and if it's got a whole lot of hex digits and it's v6, if you get a v4 address, just hit refresh and try again. Because one of the things we are discovering is that in efforts to make the eyeball experience good, a lot of client applications, a lot of client-side operating systems are tending to prefer v4 if it's there. But have a crack, and if you get a v6 address up, look at that, it works. And the deep point is, you had to look to figure it out. That's exactly what's supposed to happen. It's unexciting for the real world, but it's success. It's total bloody success. So the fact that my iPhone and Android phones and a whole lot of other things will use it if you've got it is actually the big, quiet, enabling success story in the industry. That those parts of the industry that had to do it, those vendors, did it early enough and fast enough and well enough. As I've said in previous occasions when I've stood on this sort of stage, there was a missing link in my part of the industry, in the internet access industry, in the CPE, in the consumer routers. And with notable exceptions like Netcom, as I mentioned, an awful lot of CPE just didn't support v6. In some cases worse than that, they claimed they did and it just didn't work, which is actually highly annoying. 5 and 10 years ago, there were logo programs that all the router vendors could go and get to go slap a v6 sticker on their routers. And the annoying problem I discovered is that almost all of those things were utterly worthless. Because by the time we could deploy a v6 network, the standard had moved enough and the real world had moved enough that it either didn't work, wasn't there, or blew the router up when you turned it on. And none of that's particularly exciting. So there's needed to be a whole new round of vendors talking to real networks like ours to get it all going. And I drove us to deploy v6 as a network service provider in order to increase the chances of breaking the chicken and egg problem with these router vendors, of saying, look, there's one national IP provider that's actually got this going, so fix your bloody device. The good news is they actually have. And I would say that one of the things that's really, really drawn that home to roost has been the World IPv6 launch process. The previous year, the IPv6 day was useful. This one has been crucial. It gave a whole lot of people an incentive, and congratulations to the people that organised it, an incentive to actually put their shit together and turn it on and leave it there, including that crucial bit for us as an ISP of consumer routers. But not just that piece. It's the major content providers, Google, YouTube, etc. That's actually a remarkably crucial piece, and I'll get back to why, but to state the obvious, it's very crucial those guys support the process, and clearly they do, and they do very strongly. So that was just the right catalyst at arguably just the right time. What we did in response to that, because we faced a target as being a part of that launch process. We were an early part of that launch process, so we had the privilege of being listed in a very rarefied set of providers around the world initially that were playing that game. The target was for people like us to demonstrate that we had got at least 1% of our customer base actively using IPv6 by the launch day, 6th of June. So we just quietly reached into the network and flipped the switch on early in January of 2012, such that every new customer that connected to our internet service had v6 on by default. Exactly like in this room today, you do that, the world does not explode, but it wasn't entirely clear to us at the time whether that would be true or false, but because one of the privileges of running a company is you get to wave the boss card. I said, I don't care, turn it on anyway, see if anyone screams. And nobody did, which is the really good news. Nobody did. So every new customer had IPv6 enabled at the network layer at that point. We also wanted to turn on v6 by default in the configuration of every new customer router we shipped. We managed to do that with some brands in January. It took us until about June to reach the point where every router that Internode ships, if you choose to buy a router from Internode, not only supports v6, but it is switched on in the user configuration when we ship it to the user. So without any explicit action, the user is going to get dual stack access totally transparently. One of the other things we do is we pre-configure our routers to our users. So when you buy them from us, you get the router, you plug it in, the lights go on. So most of our customers since this January to June timeframe that choose to buy a router from us are getting a v6 experience at home with zero knowledge, or even interestingly, zero notification that that is what is happening. And the key message here, and it's one of the things we're hearing this week, is that in 2012, the complete internet is both stacks. And so I would argue there is no notification required at this point, because to fail to do that means I'm not delivering the full access experience to my customer base. It's not a bug, it's a feature. That's been really successful. And using the vector of new customers is actually a very great way to do this, because there are downsides about flipping it on for all your existing customers because you don't know the population of routers out there. It's much safer to upgrade them as they go through a hardware upgrade cycle or a churning cycle than it is to try and force it back on everybody. Any of our customers who want to turn it on have been able to opt in since 2009. We're not denying it to them, but we're making sure that we don't surprise them. But for new customers, we are setting and running that experience, we're delivering a smooth experience, and we are also, importantly, not surprising them either. So that means that this is just something I pulled off our website. It's just a list of routers we happen to sell this week, literally at Internode. And the point is there's 3 brands there, Netcom, Billion, and the really super nifty made in Germany Fritz boxes. And they all have the characteristic that I mentioned, that they support IPv6, IPv6 is turned on, it runs, and our users don't know and don't care. That's success. The other subtlety again is, none of those attributes on that slide about why you should choose one over the other, there's no mention of v6 there. And I've just, again, explained why. There shouldn't be. Done properly, this is not a conversation you have with your users, ironically. You know, it's not a secret. We don't want it to be a secret. We, of all ISPs, sell services to people because the designated geek in your family likes us because we did cool geeky things. So the geeks know, but the geeks' relatives and friends don't have to know. That actually works. We've finally reached that point where every link in that access chain, for a fixed line access provider at least, is working. It's been nailed. In our ADSL customer base, that means we are rolling customers in as they sign up and the percentage is rising. Interestingly and importantly from my point of view, in the NBN, in effect 100% of our customers, where we roll the CPE to them, are v6 enabled. So the enabled percentage in the NBN for Internode is very high. I don't know what the number is. It won't be 100% because we're perfectly happy for you to bring your own router. And so we don't control that configuration. But the active percentage is very high. Turns out, as we heard from NBN Co yesterday, NBN Co is still bringing in v6 support in the network by what I could describe as planning, but it's more like an accident of fate. The mechanism that we use for authenticating our users, which is simply that it's still a layer 2 PPP connection, means that we are carrying v6 and v4 transparently over the NBN, and the NBN don't know and don't care. As you heard yesterday, they had to ask us what the v6 take-up rate was. That's good. That means they're not actually reaching any deeper into the packets than I prefer them to be. So the good news is, again, the NBN arguably, when it's completed, on time and on budget, honest, is an opportunity for proactive service providers to wind up with 100% of their customer base running v6 in sync with the NBN rolling out. By the time we have pulled the copper and flipped people to fibre, we should have pulled them from v4 and flipped them to v4, v6. You know, it's actually a perfect storm in that sense. It's a great opportunity. You're going to have to, likely you're going to roll, you know, some providers will need to roll new CPE to their customers anyway. So I certainly hope those providers are smart enough to take that opportunity. If you've got to break it, then fix it properly afterwards. You know, we're already doing that, and I hope we can lead the way in other people doing so. So having done those things, which I think are really very effective and for me very interesting, let's look at what happened in terms of adoption rate and what impact that's had on adoption rate across our customer base. So again, in the real world nobody notices, but in this room we care a lot. So the percentage of customers actually routing IPv6 packets on our network has undergone a very significant set of changes. So there's 3 data points here. One is what happened at the end of that trial, where, as I said, embarrassingly, it wasn't 1% of our customer base, it was 0.1% of our customer base that were running V6 at that point. Now, I'll get back to this in a sec, but let me be clear about my definition of running it, which is that our network observes that that customer is connected, is routing V6, we've assigned an address and we are routing it to them. So they're actively connected to the V6 internet. If we ping them, it works, right? It's not that they're theoretically capable of it, they're actually capable of it. That doesn't force their client device to access via V6, which I'll come back to, but it means that all of the path is clean, everything works. World IP launch day, we had a 1% target of customers routed onto the V6 internet, and we doubled that target. We hit almost exactly 2% on the 6th of June, which was fabulous from my point of view. It meant we'd actually done something real. 2% to a man in the street doesn't sound like an awful lot, but compared to 0.1%, that's actually an enormous bloody growth rate. And importantly for us as service providers, the measurable instance of customers saying, you've messed me up, take this nasty protocol away, is effectively 0. And that's a combination of efforts from lots of people, including people like Google, who've done a great job of dynamically figuring out that it's bad and taking the bad away. You know, that sort of smartness is a very cunning way to let the world come up to speed here, but also to do something necessary and to accept that breakage very quietly and very cleanly in the process. What surprised me when I looked up the numbers in order to stand up here this week was that in the only 4 months between that launch and today, we more than doubled the routed percentage of customers on our network running V6. We're actually just in excess of 5% of our customer base, active logged-in customers, are routing V6 packets onto the internet. For me, that's actually huge. That's finally starting to show the right curve shape. There's an exponential curve starting to bolt in there. 2.5 times the take-up in 4 months. Finally, something's happening on kind of internet time in a place where it finally needs to. Now, I said before, and I'll touch on it again, the interesting point here is I've got a 5% number, and Jen yesterday showed us the 3.5% adoption rate within the Internode customer base. And the difference is quite interesting and quite subtle. In order to keep that eyeball friendliness happening, a lot of operating systems are preferring V4 over V6 if there's even the slightest hint of discontinuity in the V6 universe. If the latency is higher through V6, or if a number of other characteristics happen, macOS in particular, the latest versions of macOS, flipped, and we noticed this big jump down as a result. They flipped to being quite conservative about this. This is not an incorrect activity on Apple's part. Both protocols are still there, and if you present the stack with a V6 only path, it will use that V6 path correctly. But it'll also tend to prefer V4 more often than you might think. That's all good. It means that user experience is not being impacted, but the readiness is quietly there under the hood, and it means that in practice, compared again to Jen's measurements, almost twice as many people in our customer base are capable of hitting Google with V6 as are actually hitting it. So there's this undercurrent happening positively that are capable of moving up that stack. So it's, from my point of view, it's a fabulous number. It's going to be fun to watch it. Again, in the NBN, for us, from now on, it'll be 100% of new customers going in. So that's going to be really interesting to see the influence that has when the NBN finally starts to get some momentum, and it's more than just trying to get some momentum. So why aren't other ISPs doing something about this in the eyes of whoever cares? And I guess the point of this presentation is their customers actually don't care, which in the end is the reason why the ISPs aren't caring, in a broad sense, right? No, it's not fair. It's not they're not caring. It's not reaching the top of the priority list to undergo that change that if you do it perfectly, does nothing, and if you do it badly, causes you to miss your performance bonus. So I guess we've done it because we like being early adopters. But there's these obvious factors, and we heard it yesterday, about it being someone else's problem that are slowing down some much larger providers in moving on this. In particular, and importantly, in first world countries, most major ISPs that are established actually don't have an IPv4 address problem. They're not going to run out because they actually have enough for their customer base. And in the last 18 months, the growth rate in fixed line internet access in Australia is saturated. If you had enough a year ago, you've actually still got enough now. So that's not where the motivation comes from. It needs to come from mad geeks and from other things, from other parts of the world. So if you're in a saturated first world fixed line market, your incentives are much lower unless you consider innovation to be a positive thing to hand to your customers, which we do. I'll attribute this theory to Jeff Houston, and I'm quite resonant to it. It's why I asked Tony Hayne the question this morning. An example of what might be a pivot event that actually drives people to taking up v6 in droves may be a large user population that winds up going v6 only. And the obvious one is mobile internet access users on smartphones in an Asian or Indian environment most likely, a Chinese environment, where there's an enormous growth rate and where operators are starting to put out smartphones in droves running v6. And there's a deep and important point here that carrier-grade NAT, taking v4 and messing with it to deal with the lack of numbers, has a cost to that provider. Geeks like talking about the cost in terms of technical breakage, how it's not pure as driven snow and how it's a crime against various forms of humanity. I can tell you these operators don't give a stuff about what the geeks say, but they do care about cost. If those enormous carrier-grade NAT pools, when the mobile internet starts hitting beyond fixed line speeds, 20, 30, 40, 50 megabits a second, the CG NAT boxes start getting really damned expensive. So one of the possible catalysts here, and this is the scenario, is that a major operator starts running out of v6 internet service on smartphones in a new country or an expansion in an existing growing country. And the bill for the carrier-grade NAT boxes comes in, and somebody is smart enough to say, what if we didn't pay that bill? What if we just left a v4 stub in there, just enough to bootstrap a few things in our local network, and just turned the bloody thing off? Who would scream and why? And the interesting point I'd make is that Google, Facebook, Twitter, I'm actually not positive about Twitter, but if they aren't, they ought to be, YouTube, etc. There's a lot of content sources that hipsters love going to on smartphones that are already v6 enabled. And as I mentioned earlier this morning, they're using it if they're in this room, not that any of us are hipsters, without even knowing they are. So if you turned off v4, for a population that wants to live in those places alone, there would be no difference because that is their view of the internet. There's an entire demographic for whom those websites are the damn internet with almost no exception. You think about how we used to run smartphones with walled garden environments. The walled garden, which is IPv6 only, is a wall with very permeable edges. And as soon as you've got 1 million Asians accessing those places, if you're running a web service that's not v6 enabled, you're going to lose them. Imagine what happens then when, let's say there's two major airlines in that company, and one of the v6 enables and the other one doesn't, and the hipsters discover they can book airline tickets from one and not the other. How long is it going to take for the other one to catch up? Now it's financial, now it's real, now there's a motivation, driven at its core by massive growth rate and that CGNAT is actually expensive, not just annoying. So that's an interesting postulation, again due to Jeff Houston, and I'm actually kind of looking forward to that happening because I think we may be remarkably close to it doing so. Meanwhile, if you're using Internode, you're already cool. You already have v6, as I've spent a while explaining to you. So your mission is to make sure you tell your friends that if they should care about v6 as much as you obviously do, or you wouldn't be here, so tell them to sign up with Internode. And if you do that, we get to keep paying for dinner at summits like this one. That's the end of my presentation. Thank you.
Questions? So, questions? Hello, Simon.
Hello, David.
When do you think, what circumstances do you think might drive you eventually to have this only from your access? What do you think about
Yeah, it's a good question. When will we turn off these? Let's imagine the scenario I just mentioned has come to pass, right? That there's been a big global catalyst that means there are pure v6 providers. Why and when would Internode, let's say, turn off v4? And, the arguable answer offhand is never. In the sense that because we haven't run out of addresses, until we have run out of addresses, there's not a huge cost in leaving it on. I mean, there's a doubled router overhead, but we've already paid for that. So never, by the way, in the internet means 10 years. So that's the guess for me, is at least a decade before you'd reach a point where it really doesn't matter too much. And I think, again, what we would probably do, frankly, is reach the point where we stopped issuing v4 addresses to new customers. We'd actually start phasing it out, the same way we're phasing v6 in, so that we don't modify the experience of current customers. Because if you've got a v4 address space and it's big enough, by capping it the way I just described, it's always big enough. So that's what I reckon we'd wind up doing. So 10 years and progressively, and maybe never.